Thank you. You may be seated. Kate, will you do the roll call, please?
Joseph Britton, absent. Rachel Gillespie.
Here.
Kate Canetta, here. Gladys Cooper. Here. Lauren Daly. Here. Joe Silva. Here. Catherine Hudson.
Here.
Rich Janelli. Here. Kathy Molinaro. She's absent. Al Russo. Here. Amy Scalino.
Here. Thank you. Kate, would you go ahead and follow the script for public participation and see if we have any comments that needs to be added to the
The board welcomes public participation and asks that comments be limited to 3 minutes. The public may offer objective comments on school operations and programs that concern them. The board will not permit any expression of personal complaints or defamatory comments about Board of Education personnel and students, nor against any person connected with the Danbury Public School System. Danbury residents are also invited to send brief comments and questions via email in advance to dps_public_BOE@danbury.k12.ct.us.
Thank you, Kate. I understand we have no comments tonight. Do we have any comments? Would you read the comments, please? Thank you.
One email, I'm not sure if that's email me on this. This email is from Jeremy Brown. I hope all is well. I'm reaching out as a devoted parent to 2 girls who currently attend Pembroke Elementary School. I grew up in New York and was used to science being a huge part of learning as it contributes to reading and mathematics. I'm reaching out because I feel having a science fair and more science events for kids in elementary school is important. Science fairs provide our students the opportunity to apply scientific practices to problems or questions that interest them. It would increase the skills of presentation and increase the interest of the subject. Students having the ability to showcase themselves is highly important. I find it highly unfortunate that it's not made important. What kind of message is being sent to kids by not allowing them to have this? Kids go to music, band, and orchestra and then prepare for a winter concert. What about the kids who love science and want to showcase that? I hope the science fair is brought back for your time.
Thank you. Do we have anyone in the audience that would like to address the board at this time? No? Move on. To our action item. Kate, you make a board for the consent calendar.
I make a motion that the Board of Education approve the items on the consent calendar, exhibits 21-116 through 21-119 as recommended.
Second.
Second, motion made by Kate, seconded by Joe Silva. Are there any questions concerning the action? Yes,
Just a couple errors on the policy, maybe minutes. The date, November 13th is wrong, it's November 3rd. And these are written
wait just a little bit louder.
sorry, these are written by Kate and not Kathy. On the bottom, and the date is on the top.
Okay. We'll have that correction, and that correction should be put in the next meeting package, okay? Any other corrections? Seeing none? Kate, will you do the roll call?
Rachel Gillespie. Kate Canetta, aye. Gladys Cooper.
Yes.
Lauren Daly.
Aye.
Joe Silva.
Aye.
Catherine Hudson.
Aye.
Rich Janelli. Al Russo.
Aye.
Amy Scalino.
Aye. Motion so carried. Thank you. We're gonna move on down the agenda. Do we have anyone from our education staff to come before the board tonight? Seeing none, we have our beautiful young students all sitting at the table. We're so happy that you're here with us tonight. Okay, you want to start off?
Okay. Good evening, Board of Ed members, Cabinet, and community members. Thank you for allowing me to represent and speak on behalf of the Alternative Center for Excellence. ACE is proud to announce that as a part of our effort to return to the community building, we will be hosting our annual Thanksgiving dinner on Tuesday, November 23rd from 10:45 to 12:30 outside on the ACE campus. The event is made possible by collaboration with local businesses, Epitech, and the support of Danbury Public Schools. The event will be held outside, and the event will be held outside, and ACE would like to publicly thank VPS for providing us with a tent to hold our event under. We would also like to thank Rob Malillo for coordinating efforts with the Epitech Culinary Program, Chef Mario, and Tech Culinary students, and Principal Kevin Durkin. ACE would also like to publicly thank Stu Leonard for providing all the turkeys for the event. ACE would also like to thank Sue Seri from Pippa's Sports Cafe for providing the hot boxes for the event to warm food. We will provide the option of getting meals in to-go order containers or dine in on picnic tables outside under the tent. ACE students recently participated in a local election voting project. Students researched the platforms on both mayor candidates and created posters that lined the halls at ACE in an effort to encourage students to become informed voters and involve themselves in the community of Danbury. Statements of support from students were sent to each candidate. Congratulations to both candidates for a well-run race. In guidance classes this week, students participated in activities to design and recognize the sacrifice and contributions of our veterans. Activities range from researching branches of the military, viewing inspirational videos, and exploring organizations created to support our veterans.
ACE would like to publicly recognize Brianna Villani for being voted the recipient of the October Ace of Hearts Award for her caring nature to students and staff alike. ACE would also like to publicly recognize Larissa Medeiros as the recipient of the October Ace of Spades Award winner for her strong academic drive and pursuit of her graduation. Lastly, we would like to recognize our October Students of the Month for their academic performance as well as their ability to constantly demonstrate the ACE behavioral expectations. Congrats to the October winners, Jalen Batista and Tyler Scherer. Thank you for allowing us to share what's going on with our ACE family down on 26 Locust Avenue. Stay safe, everyone, and remain ACE strong.
Okay, so my name is Tina McGill, and this is Greg Parker. I'm the vice president of the BOG, and he is president. So Greg and I partook in organizing Spirit Week, which was October 25th to, I believe, the 29th. The turnout was relatively well, and there was good participation this year. And we also had a senior sunrise that same week on Thursday. So basically what we do in senior sunrise, we get there at around like 6:45. There were bagels, and we just wait for the sunrise to rise. And it was pretty fun. There was also a good participation there. The quarter one just ended, and Greg and I, since we're seniors, we're 1/4 down our senior year. And flex enrichments for peer leadership just started, and some of the flex enrichments include like learning to paint, cupcake wars, dodgeball. I know I went to one the other day. It was like the werewolf game. It was just a really fun way to get more participation during flex. The junior ROTC had a blood drive, and the boys and girls soccer both won their first round of soccer in states. The parking lot and hallways have become less crowded. People seem to have figured out our alternative routes, such as the bridge on D3.
Hi all, thank you for having us. In the coming weeks, parent-teacher conferences, November 22nd and 23rd, Danbury High School will be dismissing early, and the 24th is closed for Thanksgiving break. Recently, the Portrait of a Graduate has been reviewed in peer leadership classes. Students have conducted their own research to understand the progress that's been made and just in general what the Portrait of a Graduate is. In the coming weeks, staff is going to be conducting their first round of Hatter's Heroes. A Hatter Hero is a student who's been nominated by a staff member for doing awesome things, not just in the class, but also being kind in the halls, having a good attitude, just being an overall good role model. Staff can also be nominated for a Hatters Heroes. And matter of fact, the first staff member that's being nominated as a Hatter Hero is Mr. Billy Anderson, who is the head of custodial staff. We wanted to shout him out and let him know that we appreciate him and his staff for always making sure to provide us a safe environment to learn in. And lastly, seniors are involved in the FAFSA challenge organized by the state. It's just a friendly competition to encourage seniors to fill out that FAFSA as we are applying for college these months.
Thank you. On behalf of the board, we certainly would like to thank you for taking time from your studies to come and inform us as to what's going on at your school. On behalf of the board, we certainly appreciate you. If you would like to stay, you can stay. If you would like to leave, we'll give you that opportunity to do that. Before I do, is there any board members have any questions?
Yes. Can you just repeat the Thanksgiving events happening Tuesday, November 23rd?
Yes, on November 23rd from 10:45 to 12:30.
Thank you so much.
Any more questions?
Again, thank you.
Thank
for
you.
having
Thank
us.
you. Have a nice night. I can't leave.
Action item A, Rachel, you want to do action item A?
Make a motion, that the Board of Education approve revised policy 1260, visits to the schools as recommended by the policy committee, and in accordance with 21-120.
Motion made by Rachel, could I have a second? Seconded by Kate. Any discussion concerning that policy, Rachel? Anyone? Mr. Walker? So, Kate, would you do the roll call, please?
Rachel Gillespie. Kate Canada, aye. Gladys Cooper.
Yes.
Lauren Bailey.
Yes.
Joe DeSilva.
Aye.
Catherine Hodgson. Rich Davis. Al Russo. Amy Selena.
Aye. Thank you. Motion so carried. Lauren, would you do action item B, please, for me?
I make a motion that the Board of Education repeal, policy 6114.E1, emergency suspension of policy during the pandemic, as recommended by the policy committee and in accordance with 21-121. I lost the class.
Thank you. Motion made by Lauren, could I hear a second? Second. Any questions concerning that policy? Any discussion? Yes, Kate.
I knew we talked about this policy meeting, and I at the time, I didn't really have anything to say about it, but now I'm kind of just wondering, obviously, we have to use, I'm not even sure really, if any of this, came into play when it came from manage. I don't recall Dr. Sal making use of any, functions that we wouldn't use anyways. My only hesitation is just that they're just now starting the vaccination process with kids, and I wonder if it's just, could we wait for like 2 more months just to give folks a window to go through that vaccination process with kids if they choose to do that. Maybe it's extra and we don't need to do that, but I want to just mention sort of that thought that's crossed my mind.
So, the policy really doesn't change much of the operation. Prior to Portugal is, the decision making falls with the superintendent, anything coming from the governor as far as executive orders, transfer of
So, and I believe I shared some of my thoughts on this during our policy meeting. I feel very comfortable with the review itself. That this policy provides an authority, number one, to waive policy. I don't think we're in a place right now where my office be granted with powers. There are one or two things in the policy that the board might appreciate looking back on. The fact that we can waive some of our rights to go through tender process and state process. Just given delays on products coming into the district, it could help us expedite some things. It's a very different time now from last year. I'm comfortable with it.
Is there any-
Yes, thank you.
No other questions? Kate, will you do the roll?
Rachel Gillespie.
Aye.
Vicky Miller. Aye. Gladys Cooper.
Yes.
Lauren Daly.
Aye.
Joe DeSilva.
Aye.
Catherine Hotchkiss.
Aye.
Rich Pinelli.
Aye.
Alan
Aye.
Amy Spelling.
Aye.
Thank you, the motion is so clear. We're gonna have a presentation on testing.
Yes. So I'm looking forward to this evening. I feel like getting the year started academically and having conversations academically about where we are in the district. So while Ms. Wanda gets ready for the presentation, first I'd like to share the presentation itself is directly connected to the superintendent's goals around goal one. Goal one being student learning and achievement, college and career ready for all students. We've identified a number of action items that help us realize that goal. But this evening really is about sharing where we are as a district with standardized testing during last year. Kara is going to explain to you that the data that we typically rely on from the state, quite frankly, is unreliable, that data from the state. Nonetheless, we still have data to report. As we all know, our families, our kids, there are only a couple of districts in the state of Texas that had their kids working remotely as much as we did. So for the first half of the year, last year, we were in Boulder. Second half of the year, they were in Ireland. And in terms of where they administered the exam, they had the option of taking the exam at home. So there's a sense of unreliability there in that space. And then some of our students came in to take the test. Carol was saying we struggled with this quite frankly. I think our parents learned quickly that coming in to take the SBAC exam was not a one-dayer. You had to come in for a series of days, and I think most of the Boston were coming in. And so we lost some participation because of that. Again, it speaks to the unreliable data that you're going to see. Carol's also going to share some state kind of side-by-side comparisons. We're not very different from the state, but we're nowhere close where we should be, typically are. But again, we're still struggling with even if that data is even reliable enough to speak to. But I think what is going to be clear across the state of Connecticut is everyone suffered academically last year with the loss of learning time. Kara, I will get out your way.
Okay, good evening, everyone. It's nice to see everyone in person again. So Kevin spoke to the goals that you all also are discussing tonight or received a copy of previously. Goal 1 and goal 1A and 1B are the academic goals that we developed testing reports and reporting out during this school year for the board to stay apprised of what's going on academically. So as a part of always the context of our reporting, we think about the demographics of our students and how that's changing over time and emerging and evolving. This year, overall, our free and reduced lunch status is 53%, reminding you that we are a direct certification and that families don't individually fill out forms anymore in most schools. So that's if they receive certain benefits throughout the state, that they are directly certified as free reduced lunch in most of our schools. So that number is slightly decreased from last year, but not necessarily reflective of the poverty rate of our student body. Our ELL percentage is up from the previous year and over time. If you look at since 1819 and 1920, just last year we were at 28%. We're now at 32%. And I'll talk a little bit more when we move to student count about what that means at individual levels. Particularly drawing attention to the K-5 ELL percentage. We have 44% of our students at the K-5 level are considered current L students. That does not include students who are previously identified as an L and then tested out on the lost links. And then 32% of our students at the 612 level. Again, there's also the SPED population and students with disabilities is up to 14%. I did break it out as student count, just so you know what those numbers look like when you break it out. So if you want to reference back, I know I love to look at this stuff, but you might too. Particularly to note in the bottom right-hand corner is our total count for the district as of October 1. As you know, the October 1 collection, the state collection, is integral in the types of grants that we receive. And so that is what we go by for our number. You should know that we have ongoing enrollment. Our registration center is still very active. We're receiving students daily. As of today, our number is 11,960. So that is the change within just over a month. And we have about 100 students who are pending in process of completing their paperwork. So we certainly will reach the 12,000 threshold very shortly. And that doesn't take into account necessarily the influx that we often see in the January month and winter months. One thing to note, I think is an interesting fact that we need to kind of keep, we talked a little bit about the ELL percentage at the K-5 level, which directly impacts instruction, but also at Danbury High School. The count for students that are identified as multilingual learners is 692 this year. Just in 2018-19, which was really our last tested year before this past year, we only had 434. So that's a drastic increase to the amount of students that we're servicing at the high school level. In addition, our kindergarten number, which is broken out on a different slide, or I could provide as a follow-up, but is currently 935 compared to our 820 as last year. So certainly some folks have held their kindergartner from during the pandemic year. They've enrolled as a kindergartner, and some have enrolled as first graders. So that number kind of has increased in both and interspersed across both grade levels. To note also, this is the count, but if you look at it from a percentage perspective, our students who identify as Hispanic or Latino is up to 60% of our student body, and that's a 7 percentage point increase from last year alone. Okay, just to make it a little more readable for you all, this is kind of our pre-K broken out. We don't identify students as English language learners until they hit kindergarten. That's why that's not on this slide. And certainly we have our special education preschool classrooms, which are the reason why those numbers are high. When we're looking at the K-5, this is our count and what we're looking at across all schools, just so you can, there's some level of comparability. To note particular schools of Morris Street, Park, South Street, and EAS, all of their ELL populations are above 50% of their total students. 612, this is kind of the breakout, a little more typical than what we see, but again, an increase in percentage of our ELL, slight decrease of our free reduced lunch. So, what we move into first, and Kevin spoke to this, and Mr. Walton spoke to this earlier, around what we expected or didn't expect on the Smarter Balance assessment. As you know, we test students in grades 3 through 8 using the SBAC, which is what Connecticut uses as its benchmark testing for students. It was not administered during the 1920 school year due to the pandemic and school closure or remote learning, and it was administered remotely and in person during the 2021 school year. Both years have been waived as a part of the USDE's waiver that Connecticut sought to make it not tied to the accountability index. So it is not tied to our district performance index, our school performance index, and those pieces, but they still are reporting out the results. So one thing to just be super cautious about, and the state really reiterates quite a bit, is that these test results should be taken in the context of which they were taken. So some students took it remotely, some in person. As far as our district, 68% were in person and 32% were remote. The Connecticut overall was at 88% in person and 12% remote, so our numbers were slightly higher, but that mimics what our remote student population looked like. Let's see. So we'll just jump right into it. Our students overall, as a what the state refers to as the instructional learning model for the year. So that means the way that students attended. Were they mostly in person? Were they considered hybrid, or were they considered mostly remote? Danbury Public School District was considered mostly remote because of the amount of membership days that students were remote. So even though we know we switched to hybrid in most places mid-year, when you look at the number of days and the percentage that students spent remotely, that's why it's reported out that way. So one of the things that we saw at the elementary level, this particular data is not cohorted. So this means, how did third grade do in 2017, 18, 18, 19, and then 20 and 21? Obviously, it's not reported out for 1920, so it skips a year. So in general, you can see that we were pretty stable for a couple years of where we were with our outcomes, but in general, around a 20 percentage point decrease at the elementary level for the achievement. Now, this isn't cohorted kids, so this is just how our third grade typically performs in the achievement. Let's see, so another piece to consider is that the state overall did not see a significant change in results from students who took it remotely and or in person in ELA, except for the third grade, and we saw the same trend. Students who actually took it remotely scored higher, and so one of the things that they're considering is the mode of the test, and or was it really around student achievement? They're doing more research around that. So we moved to 6-8. There was not as a significant drop at the elementary level, but 6th grade. With the lower grade level, we saw a more significant drop, but in the 8th grade, only a 5.4% drop. And again, those scores, particularly in 8th grade, hover around the same place over time. Now, this is a rough cohort. So this is like how particular, not a direct student match, but how students on that grade level performed as a rough cohort. So that means that if you take that current 6th grade who took it in the spring, that's the current 6th grade when they took it in 18-19, and they were 4th graders at that point because they didn't take it as 5th graders, and then how they performed as 3rd graders. So you could do more of a comparability of what the learning loss was, possibly around achievement for that grade level as it relates to grade level standards. For this, let's see, so just remembering between the green and the blue, that's a 2-year gap, right? So like they took it, or by the time they took it again, they hadn't seen the test. It was like their 2nd year of taking. Okay. So met or exceeded proficiency for all tested grades. This is by subgroup. Just a reminder, it's on the previous or the goal slide, are high need students, which the state uses quite a bit to determine how students are doing, that have that are either English language learners identified, students with disabilities, as well as free as reduced lunch students. So in that group, you can be all three students, or you can be in all three categories, or you could just be in one. Okay, so it's just considered a high need group, and this is how students did reported out, not cohorted at all. So just kind of how that's over time as a district as a whole. Let's see. Moving into math, it was also the CSDE reported out that across Connecticut there was more significant loss in math. So when we're considering what our numbers look like, around between a 22% drop up to a 31.5 to back to a 25, we're really looking at, there was the same trend that the state was seeing, a more significant loss for the students in mathematics. And that is grades 3 through 5. Also, they saw more significant change and difference for students who took it remotely in math compared to students who took it in person. Again, they're going to come back with some more research around that. So these students, again, in 6 to 8, it was less of a loss, but there's lower proficiency overall when you consider the years over time. When we move to the rough cohort trend, we have, I'm in the right place. Okay, so similarly, this is where we were. Obviously, there was a dramatic change in 6th grade and considered significant for their students when we consider how they did over time. Again, that's a 2-year gap from when they took the previous test. And then this is the subgroup piece. So again, this is students being tested at grade level standards for their particular grade, but overall the district as an aggregate. The next assessment that was used or was administered in the spring was the Next Generation Science Standard. We only had one previous year data, and that was in 1819. It was not administered in 1920. So the results of the 2 years are side by side, noting that there's a gap in between. It was interesting that grade 8 got the same exact proficiency scores between 1819 and 2021. The Next Generation Science Standards assessment is only administered in 5th, 8th, and 11th grade. We saw a similar trend as the state in that test participation was much lower with our remote students compared to our in-person. And what Mr. Walson talked about previously around the challenges of students who were in remote attendance and having to come in school and take it and those pieces, or to be remotely proctored, but it was much lower participation rates for those students. And then the levels which students performed at and the count and percentage are on the left. Finally, the SAT as a requirement for an accountability index for our district and the high school, grade 11, must participate in the SAT school day. That's a Connecticut state requirement. Just a couple facts about the SAT. We did not have an SAT school day in 1920, but we did administer it in person only in 2021. And so there, just a little bit of information around benchmarks here. One thing to consider, so sometimes there's a way of looking at it regarding average mean score and things like that, but the way the state looks at it is how students are hitting particular benchmarks. The state of Connecticut developed those benchmarks to say whether or not our student was hitting the proficiency level. They actually did a study around students' performance in freshman year of college and how those students scored or what grades they received, C or better, in their English and math courses to consider whether the benchmark was correlated. In this point, we use the benchmark to consider similarly to report out as we do the SBAC, right? So in this case, we saw a 10% drop point for our whole group and just a 3% in our math. And then you can see the difference in particular subgroups. And finally, this is a place where we do have the direct side-by-side comparison. I thought it was interesting to note. Although this data is public, it's not reported out as a state, so typically you'd be able to go onto EdSite and they would have the data that you can look up. In this case, for SBAC as well as SAT, it's not reported out that way this year because they're being very careful to not compare in-person testing, remote testing, different demographics and subgroups, what instructional learning models students are in. So it's very specific the way you can make comparisons. So if I were to do that for you, it would be a very immense report. But so we tried to go with a little more of a higher level aggregate. But this is probably one of our best comparisons to say, since we were considered fully or mostly remote during the 2021 school year, how did our students do compared to the state? So we don't have reporting features for the other two models, but we had for levels 3 and 4, which is at benchmark for the SAT, we saw a similar trend of the state. So they were about 48.8%, we were at 40, their math was at 25.2, we were at 19.4. So considering the instructional model being similar, that students were mostly remote, that's probably one of the better comparisons that we can say what our students did side by side with the state overall. And just to considerations for outcomes and I just took this directly from the guidance they're giving us, right? And so we want to just make sure we're careful to give context to this data, to consider the instructional model for the students, how they were learning, were they in attendance in person, were they in attendance remote, and then how they tested. Certainly we're developing, protocols and systems within our school district to address more formatively what students need as far as instruction, as well as using IABs and other forms of assessment like the DIBELS, and in other, a lot of different places to see how we can support students considering their experience during the pandemic. And so some of those things are on the last slide, and Dr. Casimiro can certainly speak to them as a lot of them stem from the work with the curriculum administrators and the principals.
Thank you, Kara. I just want to, the data this year in particular was quite intense to go through and make some comparisons. Kara's been certainly a gift to us over the last couple of years, but in terms of analyzing this recent round of data, thank you very much. So the current ongoing work, some of this we spoke about in the last board meeting or two, in terms of our ability through ESSER to be able to purchase and acquire some programs and some resources that we haven't had in the past. And so these are outlined here. When it comes to our K-5 literacy, even prior to the pandemic, we had identified a need to really increase the structured phonics in our elementary schools, and so as a result, we did research and select the Being a Reader program that is slowly being implemented in terms of the development and the rollout of that. We've been working hard on intervention and the alignment. As you remember, we made a shift with adding student support specialists into every school so that there was a connection to tiered intervention to ensure that we bolstered those areas. At the same time, we redesigned the coaching plan. So we had coaches that were dedicated to coaching and student support specialists to work with students. Prior to that, they were doing kind of both, and having, it really spread quite thin with that. And so we redesigned that, and we think that will yield some results over time, of course. The coaches are very critical to improving Tier 1 instruction that prevents some of the things that turn up in intervention, holes and gaps. And so we have to balance both, and that has really been the plan of the attack. Everything else up there in terms of the math and the literacy are really programmatic shifts that we've made with the idea that our population is changing. And so how do we select more universally designed materials to reach our populations of students so that we are making sure that we're purchasing resources and acquiring resources that have a high level of differentiation already embedded at the start to help with the teachers in making those selections and guiding students. And so we are also still engaged. Remember, a few years ago, we started department
specializing in some areas. That is still continuing, even in this environment. So we tend to use some of the departmentalization to do a little bit of field testing and piloting of some new things, and that has been successful. And it works well in some schools based on the consistency of the makeup of the schools, how many grade levels they have, and sort of the makeup of the grade level in general. We've been tracking and monitoring how those who are doing departmentalization is going. We'd like to get a little more time and data around that before we decide if that's something that we want to grow out across the district. But the high school, there's a pretty big academy action plan in place for the next 4 years, and so we really believe, as you know, that that's something that's going to help increase engagement, help with our graduation rates, it's going to help produce graduates that are going to be career ready when they exit. So that's that in itself is a grand plan for which we're hoping that achievement follows some of these initiatives. Humanities, we continue with professional development. We've been focusing on project-based learning over the last couple of years. Grade level text and close reading, so really raising the level of rigor, but at the same time helping stay with students to help them unpack complex text. I mentioned a little bit about the interventions. These are not necessarily new, with the exception of the Do the Math and the SIPs programs that are up there, and that's really just about deepening our understanding of interventions, not just purchasing a program, but knowing when to apply an intervention for the right time, the right moment, as students need them. So really getting better at diagnosing what the issue is and then prescribing the right academic kind of course of treatment, if you will, when it comes to students. We have struggled with mathematics in the district for a while. The best way to get to that is to get at the bottom, from the bottom to the top. So we're going to start with kindergarten and roll out what we believe will be a better aligned system for teaching mathematics and for developing, having students understand those math, teachers understand mathematical practices, and then students really digging deep into understanding sort of the conceptual side of math that maybe will help with sort of this building the foundation across the K-12 continuum. Someone mentioned science tonight in one of the comments. Happy to report that we are very much rolling out the 3-5 science. Again, slow. I mentioned that in the last board meetings that we are working towards that, and we're trying to really be sensitive to the needs of teachers and the time that's taken right now with students, but that is very much still on the docket. And lots of new and exciting units and supplies and experiments that kids will be diving into this year that have been great. Kara Wanzer mentioned interim assessment blocks. I just want to explain about what those are. So these are smaller snippets of the SBUG assessment that we can have students take in smaller chunks and then deconstruct those problems with students when we get the results. It's a little bit more of a formative use of assessment before we get to sort of the bigger summative side, right? So how can we break down some of these skill sets and help students understand how to attack some of the problems, and how do we embed some of those skills a little bit more in our curriculum over time. So we are also going slowly with that, but math has been using those, and we're looking to expand that into on the literacy side. Professional development, illustrative math, that we've been doing illustrative math for about 2 years now, and we hope to the two worlds will meet. So rolling up from K2 and backwards from 6-8, so that we have a full continuum across. We've been working on geometry and algebra alignments, and Melissa McDew, shout out to her, she's doing a lot of great work with that. We're working with the teachers. And then probably one of the larger shifts that we've made is really switching the way that we approach ESL in our district and making sure that it's a systemic ELD, English language development across the school day, and really concentrating on what those services look like to make sure that we're delivering highly efficient, highly targeted curriculum to our second language learners. We've bolstered down in our newcomers program. That's a program that was a pilot a few years ago, has now become sort of standard. When our newcomers come in, that there's a specific curriculum that's special for them, as really kind of entry level, separating them and making sure that they have different needs than a student who's been here for a year or so, who has acquired much more. We work on KELP standards and SIAP coaching. KELP standards are really to help teachers, guide teachers on what's appropriate for an ESL student in particular classes. SIAP coaching are the strategies that we use with our ESL students that are great for all kids, but critical for ESL students. And of course, continuing working on the alignment and doing a lot of monitoring, and we'll be rolling up the ELG, which is our ELD program, 6 through 8. So we just started putting together an action plan for that. Again, going slowly with a lot here, but still moving forward. And obviously, the data tonight is when you look at it, take you back a bit, especially when you're in my role. We've been working hard to make very incremental improvements over the course, and so over time, our data look better. Right now, we take it very seriously. There's a lot of work to do, but we take the data in context and we continue with the plans that we have in place, and we work to kind of strengthen and deepen those with our staff. I think that's the last slide.
It is.
Any questions? Okay.
I just want to ask, looking at the drop forward trend data for ELA versus the math, and the drop off for the math is much more substantial. I'm just wondering if you guys have any thoughts about why that is.
We looked at that as well. It was definitely a coach moment when you see it. We've had some conversations about that. Math is really day-to-day building, right? And so when there are gaps in that, things tend to fall. Maybe a little bit harder than literacy, which tends to spiral a little bit more to draw on, as opposed to some pencil math. But it's hard to say in this in particular with this data. It's hard to, the context of when students took the test, and overall it is difficult to surmise. But something, when we haven't had our math data has not been terrific. And so when you don't have a solid foundation to begin with, you tend to become a little bit more volatile and vulnerable in those areas.
Yes, Mr. Janine.
On your first schedule, the district percentages and the enrollment, the last column, in the future, is it possible to just put comparisons of the prior years?
Sure.
And the last 2 years?
Yeah, of course.
And then anybody wants to drill down to the differences in going to it?
Sure.
And then my second question is, in the absence of 2020, a year from now, when you're looking at the data, what's a good perspective to relate it to? The 21 year
Sure.
is sort of a conglomerate of a whole bunch of questions. So you take it, as you said, with a lot of innuendos that created issues. But if you have let's say a normal year,
Sure.
as we're hoping this year to see, how do you measure then the success
Right.
or failure against what year?
So I would say there's a couple different ways, and one of the pieces is the IB piece that Kara focused on earlier, the smaller block assessments that are used in the classroom to really drill down and say students' progress towards the standards. So using that to supplement the data is very important. The second piece is that typically the state reports out on the students' growth. So, and it's very specific. If I scored a level 1 between a certain range of my scale score, I'm expected to grow a certain amount of points. They couldn't do that because we didn't take it last year. But now there's going to be some level of comparability moving forward. That's a lot of times around our schools of recognition that we've gotten, schools of distinction, highly recognized by the state by our growth of the student achievement. I say that we're really going to have to look deeply at what the student's journey has been, particularly related to their scaled score, and then how they grew within the past year. So it's very specific. They give us great targets around that, so it helps us to really see, yes, there was this blip in data, but this is how the student was growing before. Have they picked up on that growth again? The state also, this past year, they did not report out growth scores due to the fact we didn't take it in 1920, but they did their own projections on what students looked like at the end of 18-19 and then how they scored in 2021. And when you look at the state as an aggregate, the lower achievement levels did not grow as much. And that's actually very atypical. So we actually typically see those students growing the most. And so we kind of really mimic that with the state's results. So considering that those students with lower proficiency levels didn't grow as much, we need to take that into context and then see, now that we're back in person, are students starting to hit their growth targets again? They may be at lower achievement levels, but are they moving a full year's worth of growth?
My final question would be, then during the course of the current year, are we able to then advise the board of any data or progress, let's say, be positive?
Sure.
The progress we're making on these individual assessments and how are we improved them? Would it be done periodically, whether it be quarterly, or do you have to wait one school year to combine all those, to accumulate all that data and then put it
Sure.
in an assessment?
So we certainly have, the only comparability to the large summative testing that's standardized is to wait a year, right? But we are doing other universal screeners, and that's required by the state and for our alliance funding and other pieces, and for just good informed instruction, that we could, if I sit with Dr. Casimiro, Mr. Walson, around like what would be appropriate to report out to the board, because we are doing, certainly the teachers are working hard at assessing students to see where they are to meet their needs. And then for planning purposes from a departmental level. We do have the DIBELS, we still are administering STAR 612, but in considering these are students who are coming back to school, full-time in person for the first time, there's some level of fatigue around what they're able to perform. So just not asking too much and really wanting to sit with the instruction with the students for a while. We're really trying to focus on those formative assessments too. So certainly, as requested, we've talked about testing reports that we're going to address later in the year around graduation, college and career readiness. If there's a mid-year report, we can certainly speak to that.
Thank you very
You're
much.
welcome. Yep. Got it? Got it?
I just wanted to ask Kara and Kara for some, Dr. Casimiro first. Kara, I believe last meeting you talked about the legislation around K-5 literacy and reading. And I guess my first wondering is, to the board and to the public, maybe make the connections to kind of our next steps around this work, why it's so meaningful and how this might help us right now this year, but why it's so important for kind of land on the right literacy reading program.
Sure, so right now, we're in a little bit of we had started to do some small pilots with some other curriculum, that we thought was very standards based, and rigorous, but accessible, that universal design that we spoke of earlier. And so we're gonna continue to kind of pilot, on a small side right now, because going larger, not making a lot of sense right now, to do that given everything that's going on. But we're gonna hold a little bit, the intention is to obviously to do, a deepening of our K-5 literacy program. It has started with the Being a Reader program, which is really the foundational, literacy component, which, prior to, pandemic and all of that, when we had, kind of a literacy committee and digging deep into some of the data, realizing that we had some holes in our programming, and we had some resources that were more than 15 years old with, missing components and, spread out over time, and maybe not necessarily, folks are well versed in this. And so it started with making sure that we had a structured literacy program to begin with, which is the selection of the Being a Reader program, but also how do you marry that with a rigorous, comprehension program and rigorous other components to literacy that meets the needs of our learners. And our learners have changed over time in terms of what their needs are. And so the right to read legislation, which I mentioned last time that we were here, that group, those are groups that have heard that will be putting out a recommendation for reading free programs that districts have to back into. And so we're in a little bit of a pause before we push any further on any material selection or gathering committees until that information is published. And at that time, we'll gather our folks and we'll take a deep dive into to our next steps in terms of our approach. But we would like to definitely continue to improve what we're doing with the K-5 literacy in particular, especially around the fact that we have so many ESL students, and so many of our ESL students, percentage-wise, start with us in our lowest grades. So we really need to address that one.
Thank you. And just one more thing, departmentalization. For the board members who may not be aware of what that is, and for our families at home that don't know what that is, I know we've experienced some success in some of our schools. Just walking through what that is.
Sure. So whereas a typical classroom teacher at the elementary school would teach all the components of literacy program, and teach science per se, mathematics, writing in the day. If you have 4 teachers across the grade level, then in a departmentalization model, you would have students moving throughout the 4 teachers through the day. One teacher focusing on the math, one teacher focusing on the reading, one maybe potentially the writing, or science. And so in theory, it allows not in theory, but in practice, it does allow the teacher to concentrate a little bit more in those areas and focus and plan. It also, there's some pros and cons to it. One, we'd like to make sure that teachers are kind of connecting material in an interdisciplinary way, making those connections throughout the day. It's a little bit harder for you to do when the kids are separate. But at the same time, students on the student side, especially with 4th and 5th grade, and only one school is doing it in 3rd grade, students get a chance to interact with other teachers and sometimes slightly different expectations and things that they have to do. They have to navigate 4 teachers, which sort of tends to raise the level of independence a little bit more quickly at the elementary level. And also, they get to know more of the teachers in the school. There's a lot of benefits to it as well. And so, where it's happening right now, AAS, South Street and Shelter, that is, they like it. And the teachers feel that it's beneficial, and the kids seem to be responding well to it. The tricky part about it is that it's not equal everywhere, right? So it's not something you just roll up and roll out without a lot of careful planning. And every school is different, every configuration across the grade level looks differently. But that is happening, and where it is happening, folks are quite pleased with it. So we had a school that was doing some looping, and so right when the pandemic took hold, it was also the time of the principal change in that one location as well. And so I think there are some practices that they took that are good in terms of the full looping. That probably be the discussion in the spring about whether or not that's going to be again.
My question, and if I look at the SAT data, there's 3 groups that are very, very low. So I guess my question